At 3:17 in the morning on November 29, 1944, a periscope broke the surface of the Pacific Ocean 60 miles south of Tokyo Bay. Behind the eyepiece stood a submarine captain who had asked to be fired from his last command. Ahead of him, silhouetted against the dark water, sat a ship longer than 2.5 football fields, the newest and largest warship the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever built. She had been afloat for exactly 10 days. By morning she would be gone, and with her would go the record for the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a record that still stands today. The ship, on the other end of that periscope, had been built in near total secrecy, so secret that the men who fired on her that night had no idea what they were actually looking at, and the country that built her would not learn her fate with certainty for years. Everything about the encounter, the size mismatch between hunter and hunted, the captain's own history of self-doubt, and the sheer improbability of the numbers involved reads less like a routine wartime patrol report and more like the kind of story that sounds invented, except that every piece of it is documented in official records on both sides of the Pacific. This is the story of Joseph Enright, a commander who failed once, asked to be relieved, and was handed a broken-down submarine as a second chance nobody expected him to get. By the time the Pacific War ended, American submarines had sunk more Japanese tonnage than every other branch of the armed forces combined, despite making up only a small fraction of naval personnel. But no single submarine attack in the entire war destroyed a target as large as the one Enright found off Tokyo Bay that November night, and none has since, in any navy, in any war. To understand how a submarine captain who had once asked to be fired ended up holding that record, the story has to start more than a year earlier, on a different boat, chasing a different ship. The submarine that carried out the attack was small by the standards of the ship she sank. A Yamato-class fleet submarine ran a little over 300 feet in length and displaced roughly 1,500 tons submerged, a fraction of the size of the vessel she was about to destroy. She carried 24 torpedoes total, split between 6 bow tubes and 4 stern tubes, and a crew of around 80 officers and men who lived for weeks at a time in a hull with almost no privacy and very little room to spare. Fleet submarines like her were designed for exactly this kind of mission: long-range patrols far from home, hunting merchant convoys and warships alike in the vast distances of the Pacific, diving to escape detection, and surfacing again to run down targets faster than they could travel underwater. None of that design was built with a 72,000-ton aircraft carrier specifically in mind. No one on either side expected a vessel this size to ever be caught this way. Joseph Francis Enright was born on September 18, 1910, in Minot, North Dakota, a long way from any ocean. He entered the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis and graduated with the class of 1933, commissioned as an ensign in a peacetime navy that offered little glory and even less promotion. He spent 3 years aboard the battleship USS Maryland, learning the rhythms of big-gun surface warfare before volunteering for submarine duty. In 1936, Enright qualified in submarines, joining a small and close-knit community of officers who spent months at a time in cramped steel hulls beneath the sea. By the time the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, Enright already had years of undersea experience behind him. His early wartime assignment was command of USS O-10, an aging training submarine built during the First World War, obsolete for combat but useful for teaching new submariners the basics. It was not the assignment any ambitious officer wanted, but it kept him in submarines, and in early 1943, the Navy finally gave him something better. Submarine duty in the pre-war Navy was a small, insular world. Boats were cramped, patrols were long, and a captain's reputation traveled fast among the handful of men who commanded them. Enright had spent nearly a decade in that world by the time America went to war, longer than many of the officers who would eventually outrank him in combat success, and he understood better than most what a submarine could and could not do. What he had not yet learned, and what would nearly end his career, was when to abandon the textbook and trust his own read of a fast-moving target. In the spring of 1943, Enright was promoted to lieutenant commander and given orders to a brand new fleet submarine still under construction at the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut. Her name was USS Dace, and she was commissioned on July 23, 1943, with Enright as her first commanding officer. A new boat with a fresh crew and a combat assignment in the richest hunting grounds of the Pacific was, for a submarine officer in 1943, close to a dream posting. Dace departed New London in September, transited the Panama Canal, and reached Pearl Harbor on October 3rd. 17 days later, she sailed on her first war patrol, ordered to the southeast coast of Honshu and the approaches to Nagoya, an area thick with Japanese merchant traffic. On November 7th, Enright found a freighter sailing without escort and fired a spread of torpedoes. Several struck home, badly damaging the ship, but before Dace could finish her off, Japanese patrol craft arrived and forced the submarine deep to avoid a counterattack. The freighter survived, limped to port, and was repaired. It was damage, not a kill, and it would not count as a confirmed sinking. Submarine warfare in the Pacific ran on a strict accounting system. A ship that was damaged but reached port did not count toward a captain's record, no matter how much destruction had been inflicted. Every patrol report was reviewed at Pearl Harbor and later independently checked against Japanese wartime shipping losses after the war, a process that would matter enormously to Enright's own story a few years later. For now, Dace's first attack had cost 4 torpedoes and produced nothing that would appear in the official tally, an early frustration in a patrol that was about to get much worse. 8 days later, on November 15th, 1943, Dace received a message generated by Ultra, the code-breaking program that gave American submarines advance warning of major Japanese ship movements. The intercepted traffic reported that the aircraft carrier Shokaku, one of the 6 flat tops that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was steaming south from Yokosuka. Shokaku had fought at Coral Sea, at the Eastern Solomons, and at Santa Cruz. Sinking her would have been the single greatest achievement available to any American submarine commander in 1943. Enright plotted an intercept course and positioned Dace directly in the carrier's projected path, waiting at periscope depth as the hours ticked by. When Shokaku finally appeared, she had zigzagged onto a track that passed several thousand yards outside effective torpedo range. Enright surfaced to reposition for a better shot, but by the time he closed the distance, dawn was breaking, and the carrier's destroyer screen would have spotted a submarine running on the surface. He made the call to dive and abandon the attack rather than risk his boat in the growing daylight. Shokaku steamed past, undamaged, and disappeared over the horizon. Ultra-intelligence was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire war. American codebreakers had cracked significant portions of Japanese naval codes, giving submarine commanders occasional advance warning of exactly which ships were moving where. It was an enormous advantage, but it was not a guarantee. A submarine still had to physically find the target, read her zigzag pattern in real time, and close to within a few thousand yards for a torpedo to have any real chance of hitting. Enright had been handed one of the best intelligence tips of the war and still came away with nothing. And he knew that every other submarine captain who heard about it would measure his performance against what Shokaku represented, the single most important kill available in the Pacific that autumn. Dace spent the rest of her 49-day patrol searching for other targets, damaging a tanker in a follow-up attack that escort ships broke off before it could be finished. When the patrol ended in December 1943, the record read 1 damaged freighter, 1 damaged tanker, and 1 missed opportunity against an irreplaceable carrier. No confirmed sinkings. Enright knew the review that awaited him from Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, a man known for tolerating aggressive risk-taking, but not tolerating captains who let targets like Shokaku slip away. Rather than wait to be judged, Enright submitted a formal request of his own on December 12th, writing that he had been responsible for an unproductive patrol and asking to be relieved by an officer who could perform more satisfactorily. Lockwood granted the request within days. Enright was pulled from command of Dace and reassigned to administrative duty at the Midway submarine base. Under her next commanding officer, Dace would go on to sink multiple Japanese ships, including a heavy cruiser, and earn a Presidential Unit Citation. To the other submarine skippers at Midway, the lesson seemed obvious. The boat had been fine. The problem had been her captain. Few officers in Enright's position ever asked to be relieved outright. Most simply hoped a poor patrol would be overlooked or blamed on bad luck, faulty torpedoes, or an uncooperative enemy. Enright's decision to request his own relief was, by the standards of the submarine force, an unusually blunt act of self-judgment, and it was the kind of move that could just as easily end a career as redeem it. For the next 6 months, Enright processed patrol reports, coordinated repair schedules, and handled the unglamorous logistics of running a submarine base. It was the kind of assignment that usually ended a submarine officer's combat career for good. The Pacific Fleet had more qualified commanders than available boats, and men relieved for an unproductive patrol rarely got another shot at sea. But Enright kept asking. In the early summer of 1944, he requested a meeting with Admiral Lockwood and made his case in person. He told Lockwood that his failure against Shokaku had come from excessive caution, from following the attack manual too rigidly instead of trusting his own instincts when the geometry of the chase changed. Lockwood reviewed Enright's record: Annapolis-class of 1933, service on a battleship, submarine qualification since 1936, no confirmed sinkings, but no reckless errors either, aside from the missed carrier. Lockwood decided to give him another command, though not immediately, and Enright went back to his desk at Midway to wait. Lockwood's willingness to reconsider mattered because he was, by reputation, one of the toughest evaluators of submarine captains in the entire Pacific Fleet. He had relieved commanders for far less than a single missed opportunity, and he had a fleet of aggressive young officers eager to take any open command. Giving a slot to a man who had already failed once was a real risk, not a formality. That risk is part of why the second half of Enright's story matters. Lockwood was not simply being generous. He was betting that a man who understood exactly how he had failed was less likely to repeat the mistake than an officer who had never been tested at all. In late August 1944, Lockwood finally summoned him. USS Archerfish needed a new commanding officer. The WWII-class submarine had completed 4 war patrols without a single confirmed sinking, and her crew, though experienced, was frustrated by a run of bad luck and missed chances. Lockwood asked Enright directly if he could be the aggressive commander the boat needed. Enright said yes. On September 1st, 1944, Commander Joseph Enright took command of USS Archerfish, a submarine built at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, launched in May 1943, and named for a small fish known for spitting jets of water to knock insects into the water to eat. It was an unglamorous namesake for what would become the most consequential submarine patrol of the entire Pacific War. Archerfish sailed from Pearl Harbor for her 5th war patrol, assigned initially to lifeguard duty, standing by off the coast of Japan to rescue any B-29 bomber crews shot down during raids on Tokyo. Lifeguard duty was considered valuable but unglamorous work. A submarine on station near the Japanese coast spent long stretches simply waiting, watching the sky for parachutes rather than watching the horizon for targets. For a captain trying to prove himself after a failed first command, it was not the kind of patrol that offered many chances to show what he could do, and Enright had no way of knowing that the most important few hours of the war were about to arrive almost by accident. While Enright was rebuilding his career, half a world away, the Imperial Japanese Navy was racing to complete one of the strangest warships ever conceived. She had begun life as hull number 110, the third vessel of the Yamato-class, sister to the battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest and most heavily armored warships afloat. Her keel had been laid at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal in 1940, and by June 1942, her hull and armor belt were already well advanced. Then came the Battle of Midway. In a single day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Building a new carrier from scratch took roughly 3 years, time Japan did not have, while American shipyards were launching new fleet carriers at a pace Japan could never match. Naval architects proposed a shortcut: convert the unfinished battleship hull into an aircraft carrier, keeping the existing armor belt and lower hull structure, while replacing the upper works with a flight deck and hangar bays. The plan was approved in June 1942. The result would be a hybrid, a carrier riding on the bones of a battleship, in theory combining a flat top's striking power with a battleship's ability to absorb punishment. She was given a name reserved for vessels of the highest strategic importance, Shinano, after the longest river in Japan. At 72,000 long tons fully loaded, Shinano displaced roughly the same as her battleship sisters, making her, by a wide margin, the largest aircraft carrier built by any nation during the Second World War, a record no wartime carrier of any navy would surpass. Her armored flight deck, another legacy of her battleship origins, was meant to let her absorb bomb hits that would have crippled a conventional carrier, a design feature drawn directly from hard lessons learned in the carrier battles of 1942. On paper, she was meant to operate as a mobile forward base and repair and rearming point for other Japanese carriers, a role suited to her armor and her enormous internal volume, rather than a traditional strike carrier packed with her own air group. In practice, none of that theoretical value would ever be tested, because Shinano would never survive long enough to complete the sea trials, the aircraft loading, or the training exercises her design was meant to support. Only 2 ships of the Yamato-class were ever completed as battleships, Yamato herself and her sister Musashi, both of them among the most heavily armed and armored warships ever built, and both of them ultimately sunk by American air power rather than surface gunfire. Shinano, the third hull, was meant to be a battleship of the same class before Midway changed Japan's priorities overnight, which makes her one of the strangest warships of the entire war. A vessel that began as a battleship, became a carrier, and was destroyed before she ever served fully as either. Construction continued through 1943 and into 1944 under heavy secrecy, her building slip draped in camouflage netting to hide her outline from American reconnaissance flights over Tokyo Bay. American analysts photographed the Yokosuka yard repeatedly and knew Japan was building something enormous there, but they had no name for it and no accurate sense of her size. On November 1st, 1944, a B-29 on a reconnaissance run photographed Shinano during sea trials. The silhouette matched nothing in American recognition manuals, and she was logged simply as an unidentified target. Shinano was commissioned on November 19, 1944, under Captain Toshio Abe, an experienced and cautious officer. The ceremony was brief because the ship herself was far from finished. Watertight doors were not yet installed in several compartments, damaged control pumps were missing, and most of her crew had never served aboard a carrier before. Abe asked for 2 more months to complete fitting out and train his men. He was refused. American B-29 raids on Tokyo were intensifying, and Yokosuka was no longer considered safe for a ship this valuable. Shinano would instead be moved to Kure Naval Base in the inland sea, where she could finish fitting out under better protection, a voyage of roughly 300 miles. Abe's objections were not the complaints of an overly cautious officer. He had spent his career around ships and knew exactly what it meant to send an unfinished vessel to sea with an inexperienced crew and no functioning compartmentalization. Naval bureaucracies under wartime pressure in any country tend to prioritize getting a valuable asset out of a target zone over making sure that asset is actually ready for the ocean, and Shinano's departure orders were a case study in that pressure winning out over sound judgment. Abe wanted better weather and a stronger escort before sailing. He was overruled and ordered to depart with whatever ships were available. 3 destroyers were assigned to protect her: Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamikaze, experienced ships with veteran crews, but far fewer than the 6 or more escorts a carrier of Shinano's size would normally warrant. Shinano departed Yokosuka at 1:30 in the afternoon on November 28, 1944, cleared the approaches to Tokyo Bay by evening, and turned southwest toward Kure. Her cargo holds carried 50 Oka rocket-powered kamikaze bombs bound for bases in Kyushu, and several Shinyo suicide boats were lashed to her flight deck. Her hangar bays were empty of aircraft. On this voyage, the largest warship in the world was not a fighting ship. She was a ferry. Abe ordered his task group into a standard anti-submarine zigzag, turning 30 degrees off base course roughly every 12 minutes, a pattern meant to frustrate any submarine trying to track her. A zigzag pattern only works if it is genuinely unpredictable, varying in both timing and angle, so a trailing submarine cannot calculate where the ship will be several turns in advance. Shinano's pattern that night was disciplined but mechanical, turning at almost the same interval every time, which meant that any observer patient enough to track several turns in a row could begin predicting the next one with real confidence. That predictability, more than anything else, would hand Joseph Enright the opening he needed. At 8:48 that evening, Archerfish's radar operator picked up a contact 12 miles to the north, later confirmed visually as one very large vessel escorted by 3 destroyers. Enright's first guess, based on the profile through his binoculars, was an oil tanker, but the amount of superstructure and height above the waterline did not fit that shape. His executive officer estimated the target's length at over 800 feet, larger than any Japanese warship anyone aboard had previously encountered. The raid Archerfish had been waiting to support had been scrubbed that morning, which meant Enright was free to hunt, rather than stand by for lifeguard duty. He gave the order to pursue, and the chase that would decide the outcome began just before 9 in the evening. Submariners called this maneuver an end-around, running on the surface faster than a submerged approach would allow to get ahead of a target's projected track before submerging to set up the actual attack. It was a well-known tactic, but it depended entirely on outrunning the target on the surface without being seen. A difficult balance against an enemy formation that had destroyers specifically watching for exactly this kind of pursuit. Archerfish could make roughly 20 knots on the surface at flank speed, and Shinano's task group was making about the same, which meant Enright could not simply run the target down on a straight course. Instead, he had to read the Japanese zigzag pattern and predict where the next turn would put them, cutting the angle rather than the distance. He kept Archerfish 8,000 to 10,000 yards behind the formation, close enough to track by radar, far enough to stay unseen in the darkness. The engine room pushed Archerfish's 4 diesels beyond their rated output for sustained running, risking damage to the engines rather than lose the target. Black exhaust smoke poured out behind them, invisible in the night, but audible for miles across calm water. For nearly 6 hours, Enright timed the Japanese turns, recalculated Shinano's base course, and adjusted his own heading again and again as the range opened and closed. This was not a chase in the dramatic, high-speed sense audiences might picture. It was slow, mathematical, and exhausting, closer to a chess match played at 20 knots than to a cinematic pursuit decided by small adjustments in course, repeated patiently for hour after hour in total darkness. Every wrong guess about the next turn could have cost Archerfish the range she had fought to build, and every right one bought her only a few more thousand yards, never a decisive advantage on its own. At one point, the formation turned directly away from Archerfish, putting the submarine in the worst possible position, chasing a target from dead astern with no way to close the gap. Enright refused to break off. Fuel was becoming a real concern, and running at flank speed for hours was burning at 3 times faster than normal, but he judged the target too important to abandon. Aboard Shinano, Captain Abe suspected he was being tracked by an American wolf pack, a coordinated group of several submarines, when in fact, Archerfish was alone in the area the entire night. Abe wanted to run at flank speed to outdistance whatever was following him, but an overheating propeller shaft bearing forced his engineers to hold speed down to 18 knots, the same speed Archerfish could sustain. That mechanical problem, more than anything Enright did, closed the gap between hunter and target. Abe's misreading of the threat compounded the problem. Convinced he was facing multiple submarines working together, he treated Archerfish's persistent radar contact as proof of a coordinated wolf pack rather than a single boat that simply refused to lose him. That assumption shaped every decision he made that night, from his refusal to use searchlights or break radio silence for air support, to his decision to keep zigzagging rather than attempt a long, straight run that might genuinely have outdistanced a lone pursuer. Ironically, running in a straight line at his best sustainable speed may have been Shinano's best chance of escape. The zigzag that was meant to protect her was the very thing that steered her into torpedo range. Just before 3 a.m. on November 29th, the Japanese formation turned southwest directly toward Archerfish's position, exactly the turn Enright had been waiting for. He gave the order to dive, and Archerfish slipped beneath the surface into a submerged approach, running silent with all unnecessary machinery shut down. Through the periscope, Enright watched the target close the distance. A flight deck, a large island superstructure, unmistakably an aircraft carrier, though nothing like any carrier class in his recognition manuals. He sketched what he could see for the patrol report, noting her length, her beam, and the layout of her superstructure, details naval intelligence would later use to try to identify her. As the range closed toward 1,500 yards, 3 escorting destroyers spread out ahead of the carrier in a screen, and Enright knew he would have only one chance to fire before they detected him. He made a deliberate decision to break from standard doctrine. Instead of setting his torpedoes to run at the usual depth of 15 to 20 feet, he set them shallow, at around 10 feet, betting that a ship this size would have anti-torpedo bulges below the waterline that would absorb a deeper hit without serious damage. At a range of roughly 1,400 yards, Enright gave the order to fire all 6 bow tubes in sequence, 1 torpedo every 8 seconds. 1,400 yards was a dangerously close range for a submerged submarine attacking a target with an active destroyer screen. Closing any nearer risked detection by sonar or a lookout spotting the wake of the periscope itself. Firing all 6 forward tubes in a single spread, rather than holding torpedoes in reserve for a follow-up shot, reflected Enright's judgment that a target this size might not offer a second chance, and that every torpedo aboard was worth spending to guarantee enough hits to do real damage. The first torpedo ran true and struck Shinano's starboard side amidships at 3:17 a.m. A fireball erupted, and moments later, the shockwave reached Archerfish's hull as a deep, resonant crack. Enright later wrote that he saw the fireball, heard the hit carried through the water, and shouted in triumph before watching a second explosion tear into the target's hull 8 seconds after the first. Crew members aboard Archerfish reported seeing at least 2 hits and hearing 4 more explosions beyond those, for a total of 4 confirmed torpedo strikes out of the 6 fired. With the destroyers now turning hard toward the point where the torpedo wakes had originated, Enright ordered an emergency dive to 400 feet, well past Archerfish's official test depth and close to the pressure limit of her hull. 14 depth charges rained down over the following minutes, but the Japanese destroyers were guessing at a location Archerfish had already left behind, and every charge exploded well off target. The crew rigged for silent running and waited in the dark for over an hour, listening through the hydrophones as loud breaking up noises, metal groaning, and the sounds of flooding compartments carried through the water for nearly 50 minutes before falling silent. Enright assumed reasonably that the target had gone down. He had no way to confirm it. Submarines running deep cannot see the surface, and when he finally raised his periscope for a brief look, the ocean around him was empty. Diving to 400 feet was itself a calculated risk. Archerfish's rated test depth was considerably shallower, and pushing a Below-class hull that deep meant trusting that her construction had margin. The manuals did not officially promise. It was the same pattern Enright had identified in himself after the Shokaku failure. Doctrine said one thing, the situation said another, and this time he chose to trust the situation. The decision to run deep, like the decision to set the torpedoes shallow, broke from the standard playbook and turned out to be exactly right. Shinano was still afloat, badly wounded but moving. The 4 torpedo hits had struck a chain of critical compartments, refrigerated storage and an empty aviation fuel tank near the stern, an outboard propeller shaft tunnel, a boiler room that flooded within minutes and dragged 2 adjacent boiler rooms down with it, and a compressed air compartment whose loss crippled the ship's damage control systems. The unfinished watertight doors, the ones still waiting for delivery when the ship was ordered to sea, could not hold back the water. Damage control teams used bucket brigades and portable pumps because the permanent pumps had never arrived. Abe made the decision to keep the ship at speed toward the nearest port rather than slow down and fight the flooding directly, believing that distance mattered more than time. The choice increased the pressure on already failing bulkheads and allowed the flooding to spread faster than his crews could contain it. Post-war analysis by American naval engineers who studied the loss concluded that Shinano's design had a specific structural weak point where her waterline armor belt met the underwater anti-torpedo bulge, precisely where Enright's shallow-set torpedoes had struck. The force of the explosions was believed to have dislodged internal structural members inside one flooded compartment, punching an additional unsealable leak into a neighboring space that damage control teams could never get ahead of, regardless of how hard they worked the pumps. In other words, Shinano was not just unlucky in where she was hit. She was hit in the one place her design was least prepared to survive by a captain who had deliberately aimed there instead of following the depth-setting doctrine recommended. By mid-morning, the list had grown from a few degrees to double digits, and by early afternoon it had passed 25 degrees, steep enough that men on the lower decks could no longer stand upright. Abe finally ordered his non-essential crew to abandon ship, and the 3 escorting destroyers came alongside to take on survivors, as rope ladders were rigged from the tilting flight deck. Shortly after 10 in the morning, with the list past 40 degrees, Abe ordered everyone remaining aboard to abandon ship. Roughly 800 men still on board jumped from the flight deck into the water as the destroyers moved to pick up survivors. At 10:57 a.m. on November 29, 1944, Shinano rolled over and sank, roughly 17 hours after leaving Yokosuka and only 10 days after her commissioning. She went down approximately 65 miles southeast of Cape Shiono, having steamed less than 200 miles in her entire operational life, never having launched a single aircraft or fired her guns at an enemy. Of roughly 2,200 men aboard, more than 1,000 were rescued by the escorting destroyers, and Captain Abe went down with his ship. The rescue effort itself was hampered by the same size that had made Shinano so formidable on paper. As her list grew steeper, the distance between her flight deck and the water below made the rope ladder transfer to the destroyers slow and dangerous, and many men had no choice but to jump from a height that alone could cause serious injury. Cold water, darkness closing in on the previous night's events, and a steep, rolling deck all worked against the men trying to escape, and the toll reflected it. More than 1,400 sailors and civilian workers died in the sinking, a number roughly comparable to the loss of life aboard a mid-sized ocean liner, all from a single set of torpedo hits delivered in under a minute. Enright surfaced at dawn and radioed a contact report to Pacific Fleet headquarters describing a carrier attacked and believed sunk, along with his best estimate of her size and position. Because nothing in American recognition manuals matched what his sketches showed, naval intelligence assumed he had likely sunk a merchant hull converted into a light carrier, and credited him with sinking a vessel of the Yamato-class at roughly 28,000 tons. Archerfish continued her patrol for 2 more weeks, engaging a pair of escort vessels without success, before ending her fifth war patrol at Guam on December 15th, 48 days after leaving Pearl Harbor. Without photographs or captured prisoners to confirm the kill, naval intelligence listed the sinking as a carrier of unknown type. Enright was awarded the Navy Cross, and Archerfish received a Presidential Unit Citation praising a 6.5-hour pursuit that closed on a high-speed target and struck a large Japanese aircraft carrier. Analysts at Pearl Harbor cross-checked Enright's sketches against every known Japanese carrier silhouette in their files and found no match, which in hindsight was exactly the point. Shinano did not match anything because no carrier of her size and lineage had ever been built before by any navy, and American intelligence had no template to compare her against. The mismatch was treated at the time as a sign that Enright's estimate was probably too generous, rather than evidence that he had actually found something unprecedented, a reasonable but ultimately incorrect judgment call that would not be corrected for years. The citation, accurate in spirit, was slightly generous in the details. It credited all 6 torpedoes with finding their mark, when the confirmed number was 4. Life aboard Archerfish during those hours reflected the reality of submarine warfare that rarely makes it into the history books. 81 men shared a hull barely over 300 feet long, packed with diesel engines, torpedoes, batteries, and just enough space to sleep and eat between watches. During the 6-hour surface chase, engine room crews worked in stifling heat, monitoring gauges that were reading well outside safe limits, aware that a mechanical failure at the wrong moment could cost them the target, or their lives. During the submerged approach and the depth charge attack that followed, the boat went completely silent, every man aware that a dropped tool or a loud footstep could be the sound that gave their position away to a destroyer listening just a few hundred feet above them. In January 1945, Enright took Archerfish back to sea for a 6th war patrol, leading a 3-boat wolfpack nicknamed Joe's Jugheads through the South China Sea. On February 14th, Archerfish attacked a target believed to be a Japanese submarine, which submerged before visual confirmation could be made. Post-war records could not verify a sinking. The patrol ended early, 3 days ahead of schedule, after mechanical trouble developed with Archerfish's forward diving planes, sending the submarine back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. Enright was promoted to full commander and moved to staff duty, ending his career as a wartime submarine captain, after just 2 patrols in command of Archerfish. For nearly 5 years, the United States Navy had no idea it had sunk the largest warship in the world. The official record simply listed an unidentified carrier of about 28,000 tons. That changed in 1949, when American occupation authorities in Japan gained access to captured Imperial Japanese Navy records, documenting every warship the country had commissioned during the war. One entry matched Enright's attack almost exactly. An aircraft carrier, Hull 110, named Shinano, commissioned November 19, 1944, sunk by torpedo attack from an American submarine on November 29, 1944, at the same coordinates Enright had reported, with a displacement of 72,000 long tons. Naval intelligence revised Enright's combat record. He had not sunk a modest 28,000-ton conversion. He had sunk a 72,000-ton supercarrier, the largest warship afloat anywhere in the world at the time of her loss. It remains, more than 80 years later, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine in the history of naval warfare. The 5-year gap between the sinking and its confirmation says something about how chaotic and secretive the final years of the Pacific War really were. An entire aircraft carrier, larger than any battleship in the American fleet, had been built, commissioned, and destroyed almost entirely outside the awareness of the country that sank her. For the surviving crew of Archerfish, the news in 1949 that they had actually sunk the largest warship in the world, rather than a modest conversion carrier, must have landed as a strange kind of delayed vindication, confirming a scale of victory none of them had been able to see with their own eyes on the night it happened. American submarines sank a wide range of Japanese warships during the war, from destroyers and light cruisers to several fleet carriers, but almost all of those kills came against ships in the 20 to 30,000 ton range at most. The next largest warships lost to submarine attack during the entire war were still only a fraction of Shinano's displacement, which is part of why naval historians consider the Archerfish patrol such an outlier even within the already remarkable record of the American submarine force. Surface fleets and carrier-based aircraft accounted for the loss of most of Japan's largest capital ships, including both of Shinano's completed sister battleships, Yamato and Musashi. Both sunk later in the war by waves of American carrier aircraft rather than by a single submarine. Shinano stands alone as the one exception, the largest warship destroyed in the entire war by a submarine acting alone, without air support, without a surface task force, using nothing but torpedoes fired from beneath the surface of the ocean. That distinction has held for more than 80 years, through the Cold War, through the growth of nuclear-powered attack submarines carrying far more advanced weapons than anything available in 1944, and through every conflict since. No submarine in any navy has sunk a larger warship. Enright's Navy career continued well beyond the war. He went on to command Submarine Division 31, USS Fulton, and Submarine Squadron 8 through the 1950s. He served as Chief of Staff for the Atlantic Fleet's submarine force and commanded USS Boston before retiring from the Navy in 1963 with the rank of captain, closing out 27 years as a submarine officer. After retirement, he worked for the Northrop Corporation on the Omega long-range radio navigation system and settled into a quiet life in Fairfax, Virginia, rarely discussing Shinano publicly in the years immediately after the war. In 1987, working with naval historian James Ryan, he published a memoir titled Shinano, The Sinking of Japan's Secret Supership, drawing on the original patrol report, interviews with surviving crew, and the Japanese records that had finally confirmed the target's true identity. The book became widely read at the Naval Submarine School in Groton, Connecticut, studied for its account of patient tracking, calculated risk, and the decision to break from standard torpedo doctrine when the situation called for it. In the memoir, Enright was candid about the toll his relief from Dace had taken on him, describing the months at Midway as some of the hardest of his career, watching other captains take boats to sea while he processed their paperwork from a desk. He was equally candid about what he believed had changed between the two patrols, not his training, not his knowledge of submarine tactics, but his willingness to trust his own judgment over the manual when the two came into conflict in the middle of an attack. That single change, more than any new equipment or any stroke of luck, is what Enright himself pointed to as the difference between the officer who let Shokaku slip away in 1943 and the one who sank Shinano 13 months later. Joseph Enright died on July 20th, 2000, at his home in Fairfax, Virginia, at the age of 89, and was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His widow later donated his Navy Cross and the Archerfish Presidential Unit Citation to the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, where they remain on display alongside photographs and sketches from the Fifth War Patrol. The men who served under him held reunions for decades afterward, and Enright attended every one until his death. Closing a circle that had begun with a request to be relieved of command and ended with the most consequential single submarine attack of the Pacific War. Archerfish herself outlived the war by decades. She was decommissioned in 1946, recommissioned for Cold War service in 1952, decommissioned again in 1955, brought back a second time in 1957 as an auxiliary submarine, and finally decommissioned for good in 1968. That same year, the submarine that had sunk the largest warship in history was used as a target and sunk deliberately off the California coast by another American submarine, a quiet and almost anticlimactic end for a boat that had made naval history in a single night off Tokyo Bay. Shinano rests on the seabed roughly 65 miles southeast of Cape Shiono, in water approximately 4,000 meters deep, her hull reportedly intact but inverted, resting with her flight deck against the ocean floor. Japanese law treats the wreck as a war grave, and diving on the site is prohibited, leaving the more than 1,400 men entombed within her, undisturbed. Of her 3 escorting destroyers, Isokaze and Hamikaze were both sunk by American carrier aircraft during the Battle of Okinawa in April 1945, while Yukikaze survived the war and was eventually transferred to the Republic of China Navy before being scrapped in the late 1960s. Shinano's loss removed Japan's last realistic hope of adding meaningful carrier strength to a navy already reeling from years of losses, and it came at a moment when Japan had almost no capacity left to build another one. It did not end the Pacific War by itself, but every ship, every carrier, and every capability removed from the Imperial Japanese Navy in late 1944 shortened a war that was, by then, no longer in doubt in its outcome, only in its cost. The record Joseph Enright set on the morning of November 29, 1944, sinking the largest warship ever built with a crew of 81 men and 6 torpedoes fired from a submarine that had failed to sink anything on her previous 4 patrols, still stands unmatched more than 8 decades later. It is a record built on an unusual chain of events: a captain who had once asked to be fired, an admiral willing to give him a second chance despite every reason not to, a Japanese commander forced to sea before his ship was ready, a mechanical failure that cost a carrier her only real speed advantage, and a zigzag pattern just predictable enough for one submarine to read. Remove any single link in that chain: the missed Shokaku attack, the request for relief, Lockwood's decision to trust him again, the overheating propeller shaft, or the shallow torpedo setting that broke from doctrine, and the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine might still be sitting at the bottom of a very different kind of story, one where Joseph Enright never got the chance to tell it at all.